The U.S. Army's 1916 Punitive Expedition into Mexico, led by Brigadier General John J. Pershing, is one of the most misinterpreted military episodes in U.S. military history. Much of the misinterpretation and misunderstanding of the mission and its successes are due to the fantastical reporting at the time and two subsequent world wars, which overshadowed this episode so greatly that the expedition largely faded into obscurity and few people know much about the mission today. In this video, comprised of rare historical footage from the expedition, I will explain the mission, how it has been popularly mischaracterized, and why the mission was a success. Here is the area of operation for the expedition and the route taken by Pershing. If you email me, my email address will be in the video, I will email you a PDF of one of the better journal articles written on this expedition, written in 1961 in the journal Arizona and the West, called The Punitive Expedition of 1916, a Re-Evaluation. The Mexican Civil War, commonly understood as the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920, took place on America's border and throughout Mexico, and was a period of armed conflict and political upheaval that overthrew the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz and led to the drafting of the Mexican Constitution. General Francisco Villa was a central character in this drama, a Mexican bandit-turned-revolutionary hero who had enjoyed the favor of President Woodrow Wilson's administration for several years. But when Wilson recognized Villa's enemy, Venustiano Carranza, Pancho Villa, in the early morning hours of March 9, 1916, retaliated against the U.S. by conducting a surprise raid on the village of Columbus, New Mexico, killing several citizens and burning a part of the town. This raid created sensational news in the U.S., and immediately the U.S. Army was ordered to conduct an expedition into Mexico to break up Villa's bands. The Mexican Revolution conveys colorful images. Numerous songs, written novels, Hollywood films, and even U.S. Western TV series have used the revolution as its theme or a setting for its main story. Of all the colorful characters who played a part in this revolution, none is more famous and notorious or infamous than Pancho Villa. For some, he was a hero and military genius, while for others he was little more than an opportunistic common criminal. Others say somewhere in between. Regardless, he made a serious miscalculation by attacking into America. This one raid would doom Villa and his men. In his shadow grew another star that would eventually outshine Villa. Brigadier General John J. Pershing's Punitive Expedition propelled America into a campaign that would prepare the nation for an even greater conflict being fought in Europe at the time, and define Pershing as one of America's truly great military leaders. History's first miscalculation of the mission was that the mission failed because Pancho Villa was never captured. Indeed, a so-called White House announcement published in major U.S. newspapers on Saturday, March 11, 1916, said a force would be sent at once into Mexico with the object of capturing Villa and stopping his forays. 11 months after the expedition began, Pershing and his forces returned to the U.S. in February 1917 without having captured or killed Villa. Because newspapers of the time proclaimed in blaring headlines that Pershing was out to get Villa dead or alive, the impression remains widespread that the expedition was without result. But in fact, the orders to the U.S. Army were short and direct, and they said, quote, "The work of these troops will be regarded as finished as soon as Villa's band or bands are known to be broken up," unquote. And succeed in this mission Pershing and his forces indeed did. There was never any language in the orders other than to break up the bands. Interestingly, this expedition used new technology, such as the use of scout planes from the 11th Aero Squadron. Columbus had the distinction of having the first tactical military airfield in the U.S. A squadron provided aerial observation for the expedition, although most of the aircraft were lost to crashes in the rugged Mexican mountains. A very new ground capability was deployed, armored vehicles from the first volunteer armor motor battery the U.S. had, part of the New York National Guard. Despite the mechanized nature of the expedition, the bulk of the army was still powered by mules and horses. Other accounts paint the U.S. forces as lumbering and slow against a nimble Mexican guerrilla force skilled in unconventional warfare. The picture of a single U.S. heavy column slothing across Mexican deserts, hampered in its movement by artillery and wagons, is quite at variance with what actually took place. The pursuit of the Villistas, as Villa's members were called, was not conducted by a single column, but rather by a series of small, rapidly moving forces of cavalry operating from a central base. These mobile units, consisting of not more than 200 or 300 soldiers, were not handicapped by artillery or other wheeled transportation. A large pack train was sent into Mexico, but as a matter of routine, forces depended upon such supplies as could be procured locally. The expedition was definitely handicapped by a lack of cash funds with which to purchase supplies, and were strictly forbidden to make requisitions. At the time of the raid, the U.S. Army only had about 100 vehicles, located at widely scattered posts and depots throughout the U.S. On March 14, 1916, the Quartermaster General purchased 54 1.5-ton trucks from companies in the Great Lakes region. They left the region on a special southbound freight train on the 16th and arrived at El Paso on March 18, having covered 1,500 miles in 48 hours. They loaded and crossed the border into Mexico that same night. The Americans, particularly the senior officers, were no novices at guerrilla warfare. General Funston, under whose overall direction the expeditionary force was placed, had himself been a guerrilla with the Cuban insurgents against Spain and had captured Aguinaldo, the Philippine rebel. General Pershing had fought in the Indian Wars, as had most of his colonels, lieutenant colonels, and majors, and had commanded a successful expedition against the Moros of Mindanao in the Philippines. Practically all of the officers of the grade of captain and higher were veterans of the Philippine War, as were a large number of the non-commissioned officers. Compared with many of the American officers, Villa himself was a raw recruit in the new kind of warfare in which he specialized. To finish out this video, I'm going to quickly characterize 4 main skirmishes that demonstrate the nature of the expedition and how Pancho Villa's forces were no match for those of Pershing, which might seem surprising as Villa was on home turf, but there were Mexican forces opposing him as well. I'll then close by playing excess video from this campaign. Pershing moved south with several columns operating simultaneously, and the first to contact a Villista band were commanded by Colonel George F. Dodd. officer 63 years old who pushed his force to the point where men slept in the saddle from fatigue and horses were ready to drop from weariness. On the morning of March 29, 1916, Dodd and his column attacked the town of Guerrero, completely surprising a large Villista force. In the running fight that followed, the Villistas were dispersed, losing over 30 KIA, including their commander, and an unknown number wounded. The Americans rescued several Carrancistas, American allies, and captured a large amount of weapons and provisions. Americans suffered 2 men wounded. 2 days later, a small African American column led by Major Charles Young, a true hero who had a gallant army career, overtook a Villista band of 150 men here in a galloping charge. The fight did not last long. A month later, Dodd again struck by surprise a band of Villistas near here with 30 enemy KIA, and others broke and ran. The band broke up and was never to coalesce. A final skirmish of note was when Major Robert L. Howe, with a provisional squadron of the 11th Cavalry, swooped in on this town, and within a few minutes the Villistas suffered 80 KIA and others were captured. Not a single American was hurt in the fight, although 4 horses perished from exhaustion, which happened in several skirmishes. This shows you how hard and fast the Americans pressed the Villa forces. In all 4 instances, Villistas were totally surprised and their casualties came to almost 200 KIA. By May 1916, there was not a single Villista band remaining with more than a handful of men. They were scattered, without central organization or leadership, and thoroughly demoralized. The Punitive Expedition had carried out its orders and accomplished its assigned mission in little more than 2 months. Although Villa would become a serious factor in the confused Mexican politics of the time, never again did he make the mistake of invading the U.S. Small raids across the border by bandits continued for the next 3 or 4 years, and although Villa has been blamed for some of them, there is no evidence that he had the least responsibility. On occasion, verbally, he breathed fire and brimstone against the gringos, but he carefully refrained from following up his threats with action, and he even resumed his old policy of protecting foreigners in the areas under his control. In 1917, when he approached the border for the first time since the Columbus raid, he contented himself with driving the Carranista garrison at Ojinaga across the Rio Grande to Presidio, Texas. No Villista attempted to cross the international border. Still later, in 1918, when some Americans fell into his hands, to their surprise they were released immediately and without injury. Here is film of the prisoner exchange. Certainly the U.S. government judged the expedition a success. Otherwise, its leader, General Pershing, would not have been given command of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. As always, thank you for watching.